In the spring of 1942, something unprecedented in human history began to take shape across occupied Poland. It wasn't a military campaign. It wasn't a battle. It was something far more deliberate, far more systematic, far more terrifying. The Nazi regime was constructing 6 facilities whose sole purpose was murder on an industrial scale. Not prison camps, not labor camps. Pure extermination centers designed to kill human beings as efficiently as possible and dispose of their bodies without trace. By the time these facilities stopped operating just 2 years later, they had murdered approximately 3 million people. 3 million. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of Chicago. Gone. Exterminated. In 24 months. The 6 facilities were Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Their names would become synonymous with the Holocaust, with genocide, with humanity's capacity for industrialized evil. But in early 1942, most of these places didn't even exist yet. They were just locations on maps, sites selected for their proximity to railway lines and their distance from major population centers. Places where mass murder could be conducted away from witnesses, where the screams of the dying wouldn't be heard by anyone who might object. This is the story of how the Nazi regime transformed murder into an industrial process, how they built factories of death that operated with the same efficiency as automobile plants or steel mills, how they turned genocide into a bureaucratic operation with paperwork, schedules, and quotas, and how ordinary people, thousands of them, participated in this machinery of death, going to work each day to facilitate the murder of innocent human beings. The death camps weren't the beginning of the Holocaust. By 1942, the Nazi regime had already been murdering Jews for years. Mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen had followed the German army into the Soviet Union in 1941, shooting hundreds of thousands of Jews in mass executions. Ghettos throughout Eastern Europe had killed tens of thousands more through starvation, disease, and brutal repression. The T4 euthanasia program had murdered over 70,000 disabled Germans in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. But all of these methods had problems from the Nazi perspective. Shooting was psychologically difficult for the perpetrators. Even hardened SS men found it exhausting to shoot thousands of people day after day, to stand at the edge of mass graves and fire into crowds of men, women, and children. The Einsatzgruppen units reported high rates of alcoholism, psychological breakdown, and suicide among their members. Ghettoization was too slow. Jews were dying in the ghettos, but not fast enough. The Nazi leadership wanted the Jewish question resolved quickly, completely, permanently. They didn't want to wait for disease and starvation to do the work over years or decades. And the euthanasia program, while effective at killing, was too visible. The gas chambers were located inside Germany, in facilities that local populations knew about. Families of victims asked questions. Churches protested. Word spread. In August 1941, a Catholic bishop named Clemens von Galen delivered a sermon explicitly condemning the program. The Nazi leadership, concerned about public opinion, officially ended the T4 program, though killings continued in secret. So, the Nazi regime needed a new approach. They needed a method that was fast, efficient, could operate on a massive scale, and could be conducted in relative secrecy. They needed to industrialize murder.
The decision to build dedicated extermination camps was made at the highest levels of Nazi leadership in late 1941 and early 1942. The exact details of how this decision was reached remain debated by historians, because the Nazis were careful to avoid creating explicit written orders for genocide. But we know that by January 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. The Wannsee Conference, as it became known, wasn't where the decision to murder Europe's Jews was made. That decision had already been made by Hitler and his inner circle. Wannsee was about logistics, about coordinating the various government agencies that would need to work together to accomplish genocide on this scale. Representatives from the SS, the civil administration, the justice ministry, and other agencies discussed how to identify Jews, how to transport them, how to dispose of their property, how to handle Jews in mixed marriages. The conference lasted about 90 minutes. 15 men sat around a table, drinking cognac, and discussing the most efficient ways to murder 11 million people, the estimated number of Jews in Europe and the Soviet Union. The minutes from the meeting, discovered after the war, are chilling in their bureaucratic banality. Murder is discussed in euphemisms like evacuation and special treatment. The participants debate technical details like train schedules and food rations, as if they were planning a logistics operation, which, in a sense, they were. One participant was Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, and one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. Heydrich made clear at Wannsee that the goal was complete elimination of European Jewry. Jews would be transported to the east, where those capable of work would be used for labor until they died of exhaustion, and those incapable of work would be killed immediately. The man tasked with implementing this plan was Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Himmler delegated operational responsibility to a subordinate named Odilo Globocnik, an Austrian Nazi who served as SS and police leader in the Lublin district of occupied Poland. Globocnik was given essentially unlimited authority and resources to establish extermination facilities in his region. Globocnik assembled a team of personnel who had experience from the T4 euthanasia program. These were men who had already participated in mass murder, who had operated gas chambers, who had developed techniques for disposing of bodies. They knew what worked and what didn't. They had learned from the T4 program's mistakes, and now they would apply those lessons on a vastly larger scale. The first extermination camp began operations even before Wannsee. Chilumno, located in western Poland, about 50 miles from Lodz, started killing in December 1941. But Chilumno was relatively primitive, using mobile gas vans rather than fixed facilities. The real death factory system began with 3 camps constructed in early 1942 specifically for Operation Reinhard, the code name for the plan to murder all Jews in the general government territory of occupied Poland. These 3 camps were Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. They were built in remote areas, connected to railway lines but far from major cities. They were small facilities, each occupying only a few dozen acres because they didn't need to be large. They weren't designed to house prisoners long-term. They were designed to kill people within hours of arrival and dispose of their bodies immediately. The construction of these camps was remarkably fast. Belzec was operational by March 1942, just weeks after construction began. Sobibor started killing in May 1942. Treblinka opened in July 1942. Within 6 months, a network of murder facilities was operating across occupied Poland, ready to receive trainloads of victims. The camps were designed with cynical efficiency. Each had a railway platform where trains would arrive, a selection area where new arrivals would be separated by gender and told they were entering a transit camp, barracks where people would undress, told they needed to shower before receiving work assignments, and then the killing facilities themselves, disguised to look like shower rooms, where victims would be herded in and gassed. The gas used in these camps wasn't the Zyklon B that would later become infamous at Auschwitz. It was carbon monoxide, produced by diesel engines. The technology was simple, reliable, and deadly. The engines would be started, pumping exhaust into sealed chambers packed with hundreds of people. Death would come within 15 to 30 minutes as the victims suffocated, starved of oxygen while breathing poison. After the victims were dead, Jewish prisoners called Sonderkommandos, special units, would be forced to remove the bodies, extract any gold teeth, cut off women's hair for industrial use, and transport the corpses to mass graves or cremation pits. These prisoner workers were kept alive only as long as they were useful, then murdered and replaced with new arrivals. They were the ultimate victims, forced to participate in the murder of their own people as the price of a few more weeks or months of life. The scale of what was about to unfold was unprecedented. The Nazi regime was about to attempt something that had never been tried before in human history: the complete annihilation of an entire people using industrial methods. They were going to turn genocide into a factory process, with inputs and outputs, production schedules, and efficiency metrics. They were going to murder faster than any killers in history had ever murdered before. And they almost succeeded.
The mechanics of murder in the death camps followed a carefully choreographed sequence designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing resistance. The Nazis had learned from earlier killing operations that panic and resistance slowed the process and made it psychologically harder for the perpetrators. So they developed elaborate deceptions to keep victims calm and compliant until the very last moment. It began with the trains. Jews from across occupied Europe would be rounded up in ghettos and transit camps, told they were being resettled to the east for labor. They would be loaded into cattle cars, freight trains designed for livestock, packed so tightly that people could barely move. A typical car designed to hold 8 horses would be loaded with 100 people or more. The journey could take days. The cars had no toilets, no water, minimal ventilation. People died during transport from suffocation, dehydration, disease. Children and elderly were especially vulnerable. By the time trains arrived at the camps, corpses would be mixed among the living. The survivors would emerge from the cars disoriented, exhausted, desperate for water and fresh air. This was intentional. The Nazi planners understood that traumatized, exhausted people were easier to control. Someone who had spent 3 days in a cattle car without water, surrounded by the dead and dying, wasn't thinking clearly enough to organize resistance or even to fully comprehend what was happening. When the trains arrived at camps like Treblinka or Sobibor, they would pull onto a specially constructed platform designed to look like a normal railway station. There were signs, clocks, even fake schedules posted to maintain the illusion that this was a transit point. SS officers would greet the arrivals with announcements explaining that they had reached a transit camp, that they would shower and be disinfected before continuing their journey, that their valuables should be handed over for safekeeping and would be returned later. These announcements were lies. Every word was a lie. But the victims had no reason to suspect. They were surrounded by armed guards, disoriented from the journey, and the explanation seemed plausible. Why would the Germans transport them all this way just to kill them? Surely if they wanted them dead, they would have shot them in the ghettos. The very enormity of what was actually happening made it hard to believe. The new arrivals would be separated by gender, men to one side, women and children to the other. They would be directed to barracks where they were told to undress completely, fold their clothes neatly, and remember where they left their belongings so they could reclaim them after showering. Again, these instructions were designed to maintain the deception. People who believed they would need their clothes later were less likely to panic. Some victims suspected something was wrong. The smell was often the first clue. The camps reeked of death, of burning flesh from the cremation pits. Sometimes new arrivals could see smoke rising from the fires. Sometimes they glimpsed work details dragging corpses. Sometimes the guards would slip, would betray through their expressions or tone that something terrible was about to happen. But even when people suspected, what could they do? They were naked, surrounded by armed guards, in an unfamiliar location with no knowledge of the surrounding area. Resistance seemed futile.
Many people clung to hope, convincing themselves that their suspicions were paranoia, that surely the Germans wouldn't go to such elaborate lengths just to murder them. From the undressing barracks, the victims would be herded down a narrow path toward the gas chambers. At Treblinka, this path was called the Tube, a fenced corridor about 100 yards long and just 15 feet wide. The fences were woven with branches to prevent people from seeing what lay ahead. Guards with whips and dogs would force people forward, beating anyone who hesitated, driving the crowd toward the building at the end of the path.
The building was designed to look like a bathhouse. It had a Star of David on the roof, a deliberate psychological trick to make Jewish victims feel this was a familiar, safe place. There were fake shower heads in the ceiling. Signs on the walls warned about lice and disease, explaining the necessity of showering. Everything possible was done to maintain the lie until the very last second. Once the chambers were packed, as many as 200 people in a space designed for 50, the doors would be sealed. Heavy steel doors with rubber gaskets to prevent gas leakage. At this point, if they hadn't realized before, the victims understood what was happening. The panic in those final moments was absolute. People screamed, pounded on the walls, tried desperately to climb over each other toward the ceiling where they thought air might be. Mothers clutched children. The strong trampled the weak in futile attempts to escape. Then the engines would start. Diesel engines, usually captured Soviet tank engines, pumping carbon monoxide into the sealed chambers. The gas was invisible, but its effects were immediate. The carbon monoxide molecules bound to hemoglobin in the blood more readily than oxygen, essentially suffocating victims from the inside, even as they breathed. Death took between 15 and 30 minutes. The time varied depending on how efficiently the engines ran, how tightly packed the chambers were, how much oxygen was available. The Nazi operators monitored through peepholes, watching until the screaming stopped, until movement ceased, until they were certain everyone inside was dead. The silence that followed was perhaps the most haunting part. Minutes earlier, there had been hundreds of voices, screaming, praying, crying. Now, there was nothing. Just the rumble of the engines and the knowledge that a building that moments ago contained living human beings now held only corpses. After allowing time for the gas to dissipate, the doors would be opened from the outside. This is when the Sonderkommando prisoners would begin their horrific work. They would enter the chambers, facing a scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies packed so tightly they remained standing even in death. Faces frozen in expressions of terror. Blood, urine, feces everywhere as people lost control of bodily functions in their final moments. The Sonderkommando prisoners had to disentangle the bodies, drag them out, search them for any remaining valuables the Germans wanted to extract. They had to pry open mouths to check for gold teeth, which would be extracted with pliers. They had to cut hair from women's corpses, as the hair would be sold to textile factories. They had to do all of this quickly, efficiently, without emotion, because another trainload was likely already approaching and the chambers needed to be ready. The bodies would be dragged to mass graves initially, huge pits where thousands of corpses would be dumped and covered with lime and dirt. But the Nazis discovered problems with this method. The pits filled quickly. The decomposing bodies created public health hazards. And most importantly, the mass graves were evidence that might be discovered by advancing Allied armies. So in 1942 and 1943, the camps began transitioning to cremation. At first, they used cremation pits, enormous pyres where bodies would be burned on wooden frames. Later, more sophisticated crematoria were built, especially at Auschwitz-Birkenau, with specially designed furnaces that could burn multiple bodies simultaneously. The cremation process had its own horrors. Bodies don't burn easily. They had to be arranged carefully with wood and accelerants to ensure complete destruction.
The process produced thick, black smoke that could be seen for miles, creating the mushroom clouds that became emblematic of the death camps. The smell of burning flesh permeated everything, clinging to clothes and hair, impossible to escape. The ashes and bone fragments that remained after cremation would be crushed and either buried or dumped in nearby rivers. The Nazis wanted no trace left, no evidence of their crimes. They were attempting to erase not just people, but proof that those people had ever existed. The efficiency of this killing process was staggering. Treblinka, at peak operation in 1942, could murder and dispose of up to 15,000 people per day. That's more than 600 people per hour, roughly 10 every minute. The camp operated from July 1942 to August 1943, and in that 13 months murdered approximately 900,000 people. 900,000. Nearly as many people as died in the entire Rwandan genocide of 1994, but in just over a year, in a facility that occupied less than 40 acres. Belzec was equally efficient relative to its size. Operating from March 1942 to December 1942, it murdered approximately 600,000 people in 9 months. The camp was so efficient that it employed only 20 to 30 SS officers and between 90 and 120 Ukrainian auxiliary guards. A staff of about 150 murdered 600,000. Sobibor killed roughly 250,000 people between May 1942 and October 1943. Chelmno, using gas fans instead of fixed chambers, murdered approximately 150,000 people. Majdanek, which functioned as both a concentration camp and extermination facility, killed approximately 80,000 people in its gas chambers, while tens of thousands more died from other causes. And then there was Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most infamous of all the death camps. Auschwitz I was actually 3 camps: Auschwitz I, the original concentration camp, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the extermination facility, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a forced labor camp. Birkenau had 4 large gas chamber and crematorium complexes, capable of killing thousands per day. Unlike the Operation Reinhardt camps, which killed almost everyone immediately, Auschwitz conducted selections on the arrival platform. SS doctors would quickly assess new arrivals, sending those deemed fit for work to one side and those marked for immediate death to the other. This selection process meant that Auschwitz had a large prisoner population at any given time, people who would work in the camp's industries until they died from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. But the ultimate fate was usually the same. Even those selected for work might survive only weeks or months before being sent to the gas chambers when they became too weak to be useful. Auschwitz was both a concentration camp and death camp, combining forced labor with mass murder in a single facility. The gas used at Auschwitz was different from the other camps. Instead of carbon monoxide from engines, Auschwitz used Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide manufactured by the German company Degash. Zyklon B came in the form of pellets that released hydrogen cyanide gas when exposed to air. It was faster and more reliable than carbon monoxide, killing victims in as little as 15 minutes. The Auschwitz gas chambers were larger and more sophisticated than those at other camps. The largest could hold 2,000 people at once. They were designed to look like underground shower rooms, with fake shower heads and signs telling people to remember where they hung their clothes. Zyklon B pellets would be dropped through openings in the ceiling, and the victims would die as cyanide gas filled the chamber. Between 1942 and late 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau murdered approximately 1 million people, roughly 90% of them Jewish. This makes Auschwitz the single deadliest location in human history. More people were murdered there than in any other place at any other time. The total death toll from all 6 extermination camps combined is approximately 3 million people. 3 million murdered in less than 3 years. To put that in perspective, That's equivalent to the entire population of Chicago or Houston and Philadelphia combined exterminated in the time it takes to complete a presidential term. The victims came from across Europe. Polish Jews made up the largest group, roughly 2 million of the 3 million killed. But the trains also brought Jews from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. The Nazi regime aimed to make all of Europe Judenfrei, free of Jews, and the death camps were the instrument of that genocidal policy. The perpetrators knew exactly what they were doing. They kept meticulous records, documenting train arrivals, numbers of victims, amounts of valuables confiscated. The bureaucracy of murder was thorough and precise. Camp commandants competed to increase efficiency. Engineers designed better crematoria. Accountants tracked costs. Lawyers drafted regulations. It was genocide transformed into administrative routine.
The death camps didn't operate themselves. They required personnel at every level, from the commandants who ran the facilities to the guards who herded victims into gas chambers to the railway workers who drove the trains. Thousands of people participated directly in the murder of 3 million human beings. Understanding who these people were and why they did what they did is essential to understanding how such atrocities become possible. The common assumption is that the perpetrators must have been monsters, sadists, psychopaths who enjoyed killing. This is comforting because it allows us to believe that normal people could never do such things. But the historical evidence tells a different and more disturbing story. Most of the perpetrators were ordinary people, products of their society and time, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and made choices that facilitated genocide. Let's start at the top. The commandants who ran the death camps were career SS officers, men who had risen through the ranks of Nazi paramilitary organizations. Christian Wirth commanded Belzec. Franz Stangl ran Sobibor before transferring to Treblinka. Rudolf Höss commanded Auschwitz during its peak killing period. These were not street thugs or criminals. They were educated men, often from middle-class backgrounds, who had chosen careers in the SS and demonstrated administrative competence. Rudolf Höss is perhaps the most documented case because he left behind extensive memoirs written while awaiting execution after the war. Reading his autobiography is a disorienting experience. Höss writes about organizing the murder of over 1 million people in the same matter-of-fact tone someone might use to describe managing a factory. He discusses logistical challenges, personnel problems, and technical improvements to the killing process as if these were normal managerial concerns. Höss was married with 5 children. His family lived in a villa on the grounds of Auschwitz, close enough that his children could see the crematoria smoke from their bedroom windows. His wife maintained a garden using soil enriched with ashes from the crematoria. They lived a comfortable domestic life while presiding over history's largest murder facility. Höss apparently saw no contradiction in this. In his mind, he was simply doing his duty, following orders, serving his country in wartime. Franz Stangl, commandant of Sobibor and later Treblinka, was captured decades after the war and gave extensive interviews to the journalist Gita Sereny. These interviews, published in the book Into That Darkness, provide chilling insight into how Stangl rationalized his role. He repeatedly emphasized that he never personally killed anyone, that he was simply running the administration of the camp, that the killing would have happened with or without him, so his presence made no difference. Stangl was a former Austrian police officer, a family man who loved music and prided himself on efficiency and order. He described his role at Treblinka as being like a factory manager, responsible for keeping operations running smoothly. He didn't see the victims as people, but as cargo that needed to be processed. This psychological distancing,
This ability to dehumanize victims to the point where their murder became an abstract logistical problem was essential to making the death camps function. Below the commandants were the SS officers and enlisted men who staffed the camps. At each Operation Reinhard camp, there were typically 20 to 30 German SS personnel. These men supervised operations, managed the Ukrainian auxiliaries, and directly participated in the killing process. They were the ones who greeted trains, conducted selections, operated the gas chambers, and oversaw the Sonderkommandos. Many of these SS men came from the T4 euthanasia program. They had experience killing disabled Germans in gas chambers and had been selected for the death camps specifically because of this experience. Men like Christian Wirth, who had supervised multiple T4 killing centers before taking command of Belzec, or Franz Reichleitner, who had worked at the Hartheim euthanasia facility before commanding Sobibor. The continuity between the T4 and the death camps is significant. It shows that the Holocaust didn't emerge from nowhere but built on earlier programs of medicalized killing. The techniques, the personnel, even some of the equipment were transferred directly from the euthanasia program to the extermination camps. The Nazis had practiced genocide on disabled Germans before applying the same methods to Jews on a vastly larger scale. The German SS personnel at the camps were supplemented by auxiliary guards, mostly Ukrainians and ethnic Germans from occupied territories. These men, numbering around 90 to 120 at each camp, did much of the direct violence. They beat prisoners, forced them into gas chambers, shot anyone who tried to resist or escape. They were often recruited from Soviet POW camps with the choice of serving as guards or starving to death as prisoners. The Ukrainian guards were particularly brutal, though this brutality was partly a function of their role in the camp hierarchy. The SS used them as a buffer between themselves and the victims, delegating the dirtiest work to men they considered racially inferior. The Ukrainians understood that their own lives depended on following orders enthusiastically. Showing mercy or hesitation might get them shot by the SS. But not all the violence can be explained by coercion or fear. Some guards clearly took pleasure in cruelty. There are countless testimonies from survivors describing guards who went beyond what orders required, who invented creative forms of torture, who seemed to enjoy the power they held over helpless victims. Men like Ivan Marchenko, nicknamed Ivan the Terrible by prisoners at Treblinka, who was notorious for beating prisoners to death with a pipe while they waited to enter the gas chambers. The question of why some people became sadistic killers while others remained relatively restrained is complex. Part of it was personality and psychology. Some individuals are more susceptible to dehumanizing others and taking pleasure in violence. Part of it was the environment. The camps encouraged brutality, rewarded efficiency in killing, and punished any show of sympathy toward victims. Guards who were initially reluctant often became desensitized over time, and some crossed the line into active sadism.
Beyond the camp personnel were the bureaucrats who made the whole system function. Transport officers who coordinated train schedules. Supply clerks who ordered Zyklon B. Accountants who tracked confiscated property. Engineers who designed crematoria. All of these people knew, or should have known, what they were facilitating. Yet they continued doing their jobs, processing paperwork that resulted in mass murder as if it were normal administrative work. Adolf Eichmann is the most famous example of this bureaucratic perpetrator. Eichmann was the SS officer responsible for organizing the transportation of Jews to the death camps. He coordinated with railway authorities across occupied Europe, arranged train schedules, allocated rolling stock, and solved logistical problems when they arose. He never personally killed anyone. He probably never even visited a gas chamber. But his administrative work was essential to murdering millions. After the war, Eichmann fled to Argentina, where he lived under a false identity for years before being captured by Israeli agents in 1960. His trial in Jerusalem in 1961 became a watershed moment in public understanding of the Holocaust. The philosopher Hannah Arendt covered the trial and coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe Eichmann. She observed that he wasn't a monster in any conventional sense. He was a rather ordinary bureaucrat who claimed he was just following orders, just doing his job, just being a loyal civil servant. Arendt's concept of the banality of evil remains controversial, but captures something important about the Holocaust. Most of the perpetrators weren't satanic figures driven by pure malevolence. They were normal people who committed extraordinary evil by treating mass murder as an administrative task, by fragmenting their actions so they never had to confront the full horror of what they were participating in, by following orders without questioning the morality of those orders. The railway workers who drove the trains to Treblinka and Auschwitz were mostly regular German railway employees, not SS men. They were paid standard wages, worked normal shifts, and went home to their families at night. Some claimed after the war that they didn't know the trains were carrying people to their deaths, that they thought they were transporting prisoners to labor camps. But the cattle cars crammed with desperate people, the sealed wagons with no ventilation, the corpses removed when trains arrived at their destinations, made the truth obvious to anyone paying attention. There were thousands of these enablers, people whose participation was indirect but essential. Factory workers who manufactured Zyklon B knew what it was being used for. Businessmen who supplied barbed wire to camps knew what facilities they were helping to build. Doctors who conducted selections on arrival platforms knew they were sending people to death. Lawyers who drafted the laws stripping Jews of citizenship knew those laws were preludes to extermination. The degree of knowledge varied. Some people were directly involved and understood exactly what was happening. Others had partial knowledge, enough to suspect, but maintaining plausible deniability. Still others operated in what the historian Raoul Hilberg called functional blindness, performing their roles without asking questions about the larger purpose their work served. But even those with limited direct knowledge lived in a society where Jews were disappearing by the millions. The ghettos that had held hundreds of thousands were suddenly empty. Jewish neighbors were gone. Jewish businesses were closed. It didn't require special insider information to realize something catastrophic was happening. The mystery is not whether Germans knew, but how they lived with knowing. Some perpetrators were motivated by ideological conviction. They believed in Nazi racial theory, believed Jews were dangerous enemies who needed to be eliminated, believed they were serving a higher purpose. For these true believers, the death camps weren't crimes, but necessary measures to protect the German race. They had been indoctrinated for years, through propaganda, through education, through Nazi party activities. Their worldview made genocide seem logical, even moral. Others were motivated by more mundane factors. Careerism played a role. Working for the SS during wartime offered opportunities for advancement that wouldn't have been available otherwise. Some men joined the death camp personnel because it meant avoiding frontline combat. Service at the camps was dangerous in its own way, but far safer than fighting on the Eastern Front. Others were motivated by material gain. Camp personnel had access to the property confiscated from victims, and corruption was rampant despite prohibitions. Then there were those who participated simply because they were told to and never seriously considered refusing. The power of obedience to authority, especially military authority in wartime, is enormous. When a superior officer gives an order, the default is to obey. Questioning orders requires active moral courage, a willingness to face consequences, a clear sense that one's personal ethics trump institutional demands. Most people lack this kind of moral courage, especially when disobedience might result in punishment. But we know that refusing orders was possible because some people did refuse. There are documented cases of German soldiers and SS men who asked to be reassigned from killing duties and were transferred to other positions without severe punishment. Some guards at camps found ways to be less brutal, to look the other way occasionally, to show small mercies even within the constraints of their roles.
One striking example is Kurt Gerstein, an SS officer who witnessed gassing operations at Belzec and was so horrified that he attempted to alert the outside world. He told Swedish diplomat Göran von Otter what he had seen, hoping the information would reach the Allies. He also tried to inform Catholic Church officials. Gerstein remained in the SS, but attempted to sabotage operations by delaying shipments of Zyklon B and claiming supplies were damaged. Gerstein's case demonstrates that moral resistance was possible even for someone deeply embedded in the system. He paid a price for it, dying in French custody after the war under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly suicide. But his example shows that participants in genocide faced choices, that they weren't simply cogs in a machine with no agency. The female personnel at the camps deserve specific mention because they're often overlooked in discussions of perpetrators. There were women working as guards, administrators, and medical personnel at the camps. While fewer in number than men, they participated fully in the machinery of death. Female guards at Auschwitz and Majdanek supervised women prisoners, selected victims for gas chambers, and inflicted brutal punishments. Some of these women were remarkably cruel. Irma Gresse, a guard at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was notorious for beating prisoners with a whip and setting her dogs on them. She was 22 years old when the war ended, a young woman who had enthusiastically participated in mass murder. Her case, and others like it, challenge assumptions that women are inherently less violent or more compassionate than men. Given the right circumstances, given the right ideological conditioning and institutional pressures, women prove equally capable of committing atrocities. The Sonderkommandos occupy a unique and tragic position in this hierarchy of perpetrators. These were Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, processing the bodies of their own people. The Nazis used them because it reduced the burden on German and Ukrainian personnel and created an additional layer of psychological torture for Jewish victims who would be greeted at the gas chambers by other Jews. Can the Sonderkommandos be called perpetrators? Technically, they participated in killing, but they were slaves working under threat of immediate death. They had no choice about whether to do this work. The only choice they had was whether to do it or be shot on the spot and replaced with someone else. Most people in that situation would choose to live a few more weeks rather than die immediately, even if it meant participating in unspeakable horror. The testimonies from surviving Sonderkommandos are among the most painful documents of the Holocaust. They describe the psychological torture of recognizing relatives among the corpses they processed, of maintaining an emotionless exterior while handling the bodies of children, of knowing that they were only being kept alive because of their usefulness in facilitating murder and would themselves be killed when they became too traumatized to work efficiently. Some Sonderkommandos found ways to resist. They smuggled out testimony, burying accounts of what was happening in the hope that someday the truth would be discovered. In October 1944, Sonderkommandos at Auschwitz staged an uprising, blowing up one of the crematoria and killing several SS guards before being suppressed. Almost all the participants were killed, but they chose to die fighting rather than continue as accomplices to genocide.
Behind the statistics of 3 million dead were 3 million individual human beings. Each had a name, a family, dreams for the future.
Each death represented not just a life ended, but futures erased. Children never born, contributions never made to the world. The Nazi regime didn't just murder 3 million people. They murdered countless generations that would have descended from those people, severing entire branches from humanity's family tree. The majority of victims were Polish Jews. Poland had been home to Europe's largest Jewish population before the war, approximately 3.5 million people. Polish Jewish communities dated back 1,000 years. Cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Lodz had vibrant Jewish quarters with synagogues, schools, theaters, newspapers, and businesses. Jewish culture flourished in Poland, despite periodic persecution. Yiddish literature, Hasidic Judaism, and Jewish political movements all had major centers in Poland. By 1945, 90% of Polish Jews were dead. 3 million people. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were simply gone. The Great Synagogue in Warsaw, destroyed. The Jewish cemetery in Krakow, desecrated. The marketplace in Lublin, where Jewish merchants had traded for generations, empty. The physical places remained in many cases, but the people who had given those places meaning were murdered. The trains that arrived at Treblinka came primarily from the Warsaw Ghetto. Warsaw had held over 400,000 Jews, crammed into an area of just over 1 square mile, before the deportations began in July 1942. Over the next 2 months, about 300,000 Warsaw Jews were transported to Treblinka and gassed. 300,000 people, murdered in 8 weeks. That's roughly 5,000 people per day, every single day, for 2 months straight. Imagine a train arriving at Treblinka on a summer morning in August 1942. Inside the cattle cars are families from Warsaw. A father who ran a small bookshop before the war, trying to calm his terrified children. A grandmother who has lived through Russian pogroms and German occupation in World War I, now facing something worse than anything she survived before. Teenagers who should be worried about school and friends, but instead are trying to comprehend why they've been forced onto this train. When the doors open, they emerge into chaos. Guards shouting, dogs barking, people being separated and pushed in different directions. The father tries to keep his family together, but guards with whips force men to one line, women and children to another. He watches his wife and children being driven away, their last moments together ending in confusion and terror. Within 2 hours, all of them will be dead. This scene repeated thousands of times. Every train brought similar stories. Every day the camps operated, hundreds or thousands of individual tragedies unfolded. A young couple, married just weeks earlier, murdered before they could start their life together.
A child celebrating a birthday in the ghetto, dead before the next birthday could come. An elderly rabbi who had devoted his life to studying Torah, his knowledge and wisdom extinguished in a gas chamber. The victims from Hungary arrived later in the Holocaust, primarily in 1944. Hungary had been allied with Germany but had resisted deporting its Jewish population. When Germany occupied Hungary in March 1944, this protection evaporated. Between May and July 1944, approximately 430,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Most were gassed immediately upon arrival. The speed of the Hungarian deportations was staggering, even by Holocaust standards. At its peak in May 1944, Auschwitz was receiving multiple trains per day from Hungary, each carrying thousands of people. The gas chambers and crematoria operated around the clock, and still they couldn't keep up with the volume of arriving victims. Bodies were burned in open pits because the crematoria were overwhelmed. Among the Hungarian Jews murdered at Auschwitz were entire families from small towns who had lived relatively normally until just weeks before their deportation.
The Nazi regime had conquered Hungary so late in the war that many Hungarian Jews had hoped they might survive, that the war might end before the Holocaust reached them. But in the spring of 1944, within weeks of occupation, they were rounded up, transported to Auschwitz, and murdered with industrial efficiency. The Jews from Western Europe experienced a different trajectory but reached the same destination. Dutch Jews were deported primarily to Sobibor and Auschwitz. French Jews went to Auschwitz via the transit camp at Drancy. Belgian Jews passed through the Mechelen transit camp before being sent east. These were often families that had lived in Western Europe for generations, that considered themselves French or Dutch as much as Jewish, that had served in their country's militaries and contributed to their societies. Anne Frank is the most famous example. Her family had fled Germany for the Netherlands in 1933, hoping to find safety. For years, they succeeded in rebuilding their lives in Amsterdam. Then the Nazis invaded, and slowly, systematically, the persecution increased. Restrictions on where Jews could work, where they could shop, where they could go to school. Then deportations began. The Frank family went into hiding in the secret annex behind Otto Frank's business in 1942. They survived in hiding for over 2 years, hoping the war would end before they were discovered. But in August 1944, they were betrayed and arrested. Anne and her sister Margot were eventually transported to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where both died of typhus in March 1945, just weeks before the camp was liberated. Anne was 15 years old.
The tragedy of Anne Frank's death is not that it was unusual, but that it was typical. She was one of over 1 million Jewish children murdered in the Holocaust. 1 million children. Each one, someone's son or daughter, someone's grandchild, someone's little brother or sister. Each one had a personality, favorite games, things they loved and feared. Each one never got to grow up, never got to discover who they might have become. The children were almost always sent directly to the gas chambers. The Nazis conducted selections on arrival platforms at Auschwitz, deciding who was fit for work and who would be killed immediately. Children under about 14 were automatically sent to death because they couldn't perform useful labor. So were pregnant women and mothers with young children because young children needed care that would take the mother away from work. This meant that families were torn apart in their final moments. A mother arriving with her children would be sent to the gas chambers while her older children, who looked strong enough to work, would be sent to the camp. Siblings would be separated, some to immediate death, some to months of brutal labor followed by death. The family members selected for work would watch their relatives being marched toward the gas chambers, often not yet understanding what was about to happen, but knowing somehow that this was goodbye forever. Some children tried to pass as older to avoid immediate death. Teenagers would stand on their toes during selections, trying to look taller, trying to appear strong enough for work. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a child who might have been sent to the gas chambers managed to deceive the selecting officer and gained a few more weeks or months of life in the camp. But most children went directly from the trains to the gas chambers, their lives ending within hours of arrival. The elderly faced similar fates. Anyone who appeared too old or weak for work was sent directly to death. This meant that multi-generational families were destroyed in minutes. Grandparents murdered, parents potentially selected for work, children murdered. The family structure that had sustained Jewish communities for centuries was shattered completely. The disabled were murdered immediately as well. The Nazi ideology viewed disabled people as life unworthy of life, useless eaters who consumed resources without contributing value. Anyone who arrived at the camps with obvious physical disabilities, with mental illness, with any condition that might impair their ability to work, was sent directly to the gas chambers. This included people who had been injured during the brutal transport, who arrived sick or wounded.
Compassion didn't exist in the Nazi calculus. Value was determined solely by capacity for labor. Religious Jews faced particular spiritual torments. Many tried to maintain their faith, even in the camps, to continue observing religious laws in conditions where this was nearly impossible. They would try to keep track of the Jewish calendar, to observe holidays and the Sabbath. They would try to say prayers, to maintain kashrut dietary laws with the miserable rations provided, to hold on to their identity as Jews, even as the Nazis were trying to annihilate them.
Some testimonies describe rabbis trying to conduct religious services secretly in the barracks, teaching Torah to young people who had been separated from their families, providing spiritual comfort to those facing death. These acts of spiritual resistance were ways of asserting that the Nazis could destroy their bodies, but not their souls. The Jewish identity and faith would survive even if individual Jews did not. The Roma, often called gypsies, were also murdered in the death camps, though in smaller numbers than Jews. The Nazis considered Roma racially inferior and targeted them for extermination as well. Several thousand Roma were gassed at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where a separate section of the camp held Roma families before they were murdered. The Roma genocide is less well documented than the Holocaust of the Jews, but it followed similar patterns of dehumanization, persecution, and eventual murder. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, and Soviet prisoners of war were also killed in the death camps, though again in smaller numbers than Jews. The camps were designed primarily for murdering Jews, but the Nazis used them for other victims as well when it was convenient. The fact that over 90% of the victims were Jewish reflects the central role of anti-Semitism in Nazi ideology and the particular intensity of Nazi hatred toward Jews. We have some testimony from victims because not everyone who entered the death camps died there. At Auschwitz, the selections meant that some people were sent to work rather than immediate death. Some of these prisoners survived to liberation. A handful of people escaped from camps and lived to tell what they had witnessed. And the Sonderkommandos, though they rarely survived long, left testimonies that were buried and later discovered. These survivor testimonies are essential to our understanding of what happened. The Nazis tried to destroy all evidence of their crimes, but the voices of survivors ensured that the truth could not be completely erased. Books like Night by Elie Wiesel, Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and countless other memoirs provide first-hand accounts of what the death camps were like from the victim's perspective. Reading these testimonies is difficult but necessary. They remind us that statistics, no matter how staggering, can never fully capture the human reality of what happened. 3 million is a number so large it becomes abstract. But when you read about individual people, when you learn their names and their stories, when you understand what they lost and what was taken from them, the full horror becomes more comprehensible. Consider the Kamionka family from Lodz. Before the war, they ran a textile business. The father, Chaim, was known for his honesty and generosity. The mother, Sarah, was involved in charitable work helping poor families. They had 5 children ranging from ages 6 to 17. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until the Nazis decided that their existence was intolerable. The family was forced into the Lodz ghetto in 1940. Chaim's business was confiscated. They lived in cramped quarters with several other families. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant. But the family survived for over 4 years in the ghetto, holding on to hope that they would outlast the war. Then in August 1944, as Soviet forces approached from the east, the Nazis liquidated the Lodz ghetto. The Kamionka family was loaded onto a train to Auschwitz. On arrival, the selections separated them. Chaim, at 45, was selected for work. Sarah and the 3 youngest children were sent directly to the gas chambers. The 2 oldest children, both teenagers, were also selected for work.
Within hours of arriving at Auschwitz, Sarah and 3 of her children were dead. Chaim and his 2 surviving children had no idea what had happened to the rest of the family, but they sensed the truth. Chaim survived until November 1944, when he became too weak from starvation and disease to work efficiently. He was sent to the gas chambers. His daughter survived until January 1945, dying just days before Auschwitz was liberated. His son survived and was liberated by Soviet troops. He was the sole survivor of a family of 7. After the war, he emigrated to Israel, married, had children, tried to rebuild what had been destroyed, but he carried the trauma of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life. This story repeated, with variations, 3 million times. 3 million people who were living their lives, who had families and communities and futures, who did nothing wrong except be Jewish in the wrong place at the wrong time. The victims included the famous and the unknown, the wealthy and the poor, the religious and the secular, the old and the young. All that mattered to the Nazis was that they were Jewish and therefore needed to be murdered.
The death camps operated at peak efficiency through 1943 and into 1944, but by late 1944, the Nazi regime faced a collapsing military situation. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied armies had landed in France and were pushing toward Germany from the west. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was crumbling after just 12 years. As defeat became inevitable, the Nazis faced a decision about the death camps. They could leave them operating until overrun by Allied forces, which would provide undeniable evidence of genocide, or they could try to destroy the evidence, to erase the physical proof of what they had done. They chose to destroy the evidence. Starting in 1943, but accelerating in 1944, the Nazis began systematically dismantling the Operation Reinhard camps. Belzec was the first to close, ceasing operations in December 1942. The gas chambers were demolished, the buildings torn down, the mass graves were opened, and the bodies cremated to eliminate evidence. Trees were planted over the site. A farmhouse was built there to disguise what the location had been. The Nazis wanted it to look like nothing had ever happened there. Sobibor was destroyed after a prisoner uprising in October 1943. About 300 prisoners participated in the revolt, killing 11 SS guards before attempting to escape. About 50 prisoners successfully escaped and survived the war. The remaining prisoners were shot. The Nazis then demolished the camp, plowed over the site, and planted pine trees to conceal any trace of what had occurred there. Treblinka was dismantled in late 1943. After over a year of operation, after murdering approximately 900,000 people, the camp was taken apart piece by piece. The gas chambers were demolished, the barracks were burned, the mass graves that held hundreds of thousands of bodies were excavated, and the corpses were burned on massive pyres. The ashes were scattered or buried, the ground was plowed and planted with crops. A Ukrainian family was settled on the site to maintain the fiction that this had always been a farm. The Nazis were attempting to commit the perfect crime, murder millions of people, and then erase all evidence that the murders had occurred. If they had succeeded, if the Allies had arrived to find only empty fields and forests, would the world have believed that genocide on this scale had happened? Would survivors' testimonies have been dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda? The Nazis gambled that they could destroy the physical evidence and reduce the Holocaust to an unverifiable rumor. But they couldn't destroy everything. They couldn't eliminate all the witnesses, and they ran out of time. Majdanek was the first major concentration and extermination camp to be liberated.
Soviet forces captured it in July 1944, advancing so quickly that the Nazis didn't have time to complete the camp's destruction. When Soviet troops entered Majdanek, they found gas chambers still standing, crematoria still full of ashes, warehouses full of prisoners' belongings. They found the infrastructure of genocide largely intact. The Soviets immediately brought journalists and photographers to document what they had found. They wanted the world to see, to understand what Nazi occupation had meant. But when the first reports emerged about Majdanek, many people in the West dismissed them as Soviet propaganda. The claims seemed too extreme to be credible. Gas chambers designed for mass murder? Crematoria burning thousands of bodies? It sounded like wartime exaggeration, the kind of atrocity propaganda that all sides produced.
This skepticism would haunt Holocaust survivors for years. Even with physical evidence, even with photographs and testimony, many people couldn't or wouldn't believe that industrial genocide had occurred. The truth was too horrible, too unprecedented. It was easier to dismiss the reports as exaggerations than to accept that humanity was capable of such evil. Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. The Nazis had begun evacuating the camp days earlier, forcing prisoners who could walk on death marches toward camps further west. Those too weak to walk were shot or left behind to die. When Soviet troops arrived, they found approximately 7,000 prisoners still alive, most of them near death from starvation and disease. The Soviets also found the evidence the Nazis hadn't had time to destroy. Warehouses containing over 800,000 women's outfits, nearly 400,000 men's suits, and over 7 tons of human hair prepared for shipment to textile factories. Mountains of shoes, glasses, prosthetic limbs, prayer shawls. The accumulated belongings of hundreds of thousands of murdered people, concrete evidence of genocide on an unimaginable scale. The crematoria at Birkenau had been partially demolished by the Nazis before liberation, but enough remained to understand their purpose. The gas chambers were still identifiable. The railway platform where selections had occurred was still there, the place where SS doctors had pointed thousands of people toward immediate death or temporary survival. When American and British forces liberated camps in Western Germany in April and May 1945, they found different but equally horrific conditions. These weren't primarily extermination camps, but concentration camps where prisoners had been worked to death, starved, subjected to medical experiments, and died from disease. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. These camps became symbols of Nazi cruelty when liberating troops found tens of thousands of corpses and emaciated survivors barely clinging to life. The liberators were unprepared for what they found. Hardened soldiers who had fought through years of war were traumatized by the conditions in the camps. General Dwight Eisenhower, supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, visited a liberated camp and was so horrified that he ordered photographs and films to be made as documentation. He insisted that German civilians from nearby towns be forced to tour the camps to see the evidence of what their government had done in their name. Eisenhower understood that without comprehensive documentation, future generations might doubt that the Holocaust had happened. He was right to be concerned. Even with mountains of evidence, Holocaust denial would emerge as a phenomenon in the decades after the war. Imagine if the Nazis had succeeded in destroying all the physical evidence. The truth might have been lost entirely. The immediate aftermath of liberation was chaotic and tragic. Many survivors were so malnourished that eating normal food killed them. Their bodies couldn't process rich foods after years of starvation. Allied personnel, not understanding this, gave survivors rations that proved fatal. Some survivors died days after liberation, finally safe, but too damaged to recover.
Survivors faced the psychological aftermath of what they had experienced. Many had lost their entire families. They emerged from the camps to discover that everyone they loved was dead, that their communities had been destroyed, that their homes had been taken over by others. They were free, but they had nothing and no one to return to. The search for surviving family members began immediately. Refugees wandered across Europe looking for relatives, hoping against hope that someone else from their family had survived. Organizations were established to help reunite families and locate survivors. Lists of survivors were posted. People searched desperately for familiar names. But more often than not, the searches ended in disappointment. Entire families had been wiped out. Of the 3 million Jews murdered in the death camps, many died with all their relatives, leaving no one to remember them, no one to say Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. This is why documentation of the Holocaust is so important. For millions of victims, historical records are the only memorial they will ever have. The Nazi perpetrators faced varying fates. Some were captured and put on trial. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted major Nazi leaders, though many death camp personnel weren't included because their crimes weren't discovered or understood yet. Later trials specifically addressed Holocaust crimes. Adolf Eichmann was captured by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960 and tried in Jerusalem. Franz Stangl was discovered in Brazil in 1967 and extradited to Germany for trial. But many perpetrators were never held accountable. Some died during a war. Christian Wirth, first commandant of Belzec, was killed by partisans in Italy in 1944. Odilo Globoknik, who oversaw Operation Reinhard, committed suicide when captured by British forces in 1945. Heinrich Himmler also committed suicide after capture. Others escaped justice entirely. Many former camp guards and SS personnel blended back into civilian life, hid their pasts, and lived out their lives without facing consequences for their crimes. Some fled to South America or other countries that harbored Nazi war criminals. The investigation and prosecution of Holocaust perpetrators continued for decades after the war, but thousands of guilty people were never brought to trial. The death camps themselves became memorials. Auschwitz-Birkenau was preserved as a museum and memorial site. Visitors from around the world come to see the barracks, the railway platform, the ruins of the gas chambers and crematoria. The site serves as physical evidence of what happened and as a place for people to pay respects to the victims. The sites of the Operation Reinhard camps are more modest memorials. Since the Nazis destroyed these camps, there's less physical evidence remaining. But monuments have been erected at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka to mark where hundreds of thousands were murdered. Stone memorials list the communities destroyed. Museums document what occurred. The silence of these places, once filled with screams, now serves as testimony to what was lost. The psychological and cultural aftermath of the Holocaust ripples through generations. Survivors carried trauma that affected their children and grandchildren. The Jewish communities that had flourished in Poland for 1,000 years were gone, their synagogues destroyed, their cemeteries desecrated, their cultural institutions obliterated. Yiddish, once spoken by millions, nearly died as a living language because so many Yiddish speakers were murdered. The Holocaust fundamentally changed how humanity understands itself and what we're capable of. The phrase "never again" became a rallying cry, a promise that genocide would not be tolerated, that the international community would intervene to prevent mass atrocities. The United Nations was established in part as a response to World War II and the Holocaust. The Genocide Convention of 1948 made genocide an international crime. But never again has proven to be more aspiration than reality. Genocides have occurred since the Holocaust in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. The mechanisms of international justice and intervention remain weak. The world has repeatedly failed to prevent mass atrocities despite the lessons of the Holocaust. The death camps themselves stand as the most extreme example of what happens when hatred is combined with state power, when dehumanization becomes policy, when ordinary people facilitate extraordinary evil. They show us that civilization is fragile, that it can be destroyed by ideology that divides people into worthy and unworthy, human and subhuman. 3 million people were murdered in these 6 facilities in less than 3 years. 3 million individuals with names, families, dreams, futures. The number is so large, it's almost incomprehensible, but we must try to comprehend it. We must remember that each of those 3 million was a person, not a statistic. We must understand how this happened so we can recognize the warning signs if history ever threatens to repeat itself. The survivors who lived to tell their stories are now mostly gone. The last generation with living memory of the Holocaust is passing away. Soon there will be no more survivors to give testimony, to show the numbers tattooed on their arms, to describe what they witnessed. The burden of memory will pass entirely to historians, to museums, to education. This makes documentation and education more critical than ever. We must preserve the testimonies of survivors. We must maintain the memorial sites. We must teach young people about the Holocaust so they understand what hate can lead to when left unchecked. We must tell the stories of the victims so they are not forgotten, and the stories of the perpetrators so we understand how ordinary people become killers. The death camps were not an aberration. They were the logical conclusion of years of escalating persecution, dehumanization, and violence. They didn't emerge from nowhere. They were built by a modern, educated society that chose to embrace an ideology of hatred and racial superiority. They were staffed by thousands of ordinary people who chose to participate in or enable genocide rather than resist. This is the essential lesson. The Holocaust happened because people made it happen. Not monsters, not demons, people. People who went to work each day at murder facilities. People who drove trains knowing where they were going. People who drafted laws to strip victims of rights. People who looked away while their neighbors were taken. People who believed propaganda that dehumanized entire groups. People who followed orders without questioning whether those orders were moral. And if ordinary people created the Holocaust, then ordinary people can prevent the next genocide. By refusing to dehumanize others, by standing up against injustice even when it's costly, by remembering what hate leads to, by choosing every day to be the kind of person who would resist rather than enable atrocity. The 6 factories operated for less than 3 years, but their legacy will endure forever. They represent humanity at its absolute worst: industrial-scale murder, systematic cruelty, bureaucratized evil. But they also represent why we must never forget, why we must teach each generation about the Holocaust, why the phrase "never again" must be more than words. 3 million people were murdered in these camps. We owe it to them to remember, to understand, and to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. Never again.